Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us in this first talk in our Distinguished Speaker series. And it's a real pleasure to start this series with such a distinguished, accomplished, relevant, and timely speaker as Dr. Shannon O'Neill. Shannon is the Vice President, the Deputy Director of Studies, and Nelson and David Rockefeller Senior Fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She holds a PhD in government from Harvard University. She's been a Fulbright Scholar, and she's taught Latin American politics at Columbia University. On a personal note, though, although Shannon might not remember it, I had the pleasure of first meeting her when I was finishing my own PhD. And Shannon at that time was director of CFR's 2014 Task Force on North America, chaired by David Petraeus and Robert Zellick. And I was there with my PhD supervisor, the late Robert Pastor, who had his own quite forceful vision for North America. And as I imagine Shannon does recall, was not particularly shy about sharing it. But though Shannon has developed a brilliant career with CFR, I suspect that she is known to even more people through her excellent writing and her work informing policy debates regarding U.S. relations with Mexico and on North American regional integration. In addition to the book that she will be discussing today, she is author of a 2013 book, Two Nations Indivisible, Mexico, the United States, and the Road Ahead, published by Oxford University Press. But today she'll be talking about her newest book, The Globalization Myth, Why Regions Matter, which was published by CFR and Yale University Press just late last year, I believe, and it's just out in paperback, I think. Not only does the book give great context to the discussions that we hope to foster in the speakers series, it's an incredibly timely intervention, as many of us try to understand how geopolitical tensions, climate change, technological advances, and other factors will affect patterns of production and trade. Shannon's book makes a powerful case that instead of always looking so far afield, the United States would also be well served by looking just across its borders. With that, I'm very pleased to turn the floor over to Shannon O'Neill. Thank you so much, Shannon, for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you, Gregory, and thank you, Tom. And I do remember those meetings at the task force meetings involved Pastor, always a passionate thinker and driver of North America. So greatly missed in our little world. Lots of conversations with him over the years, and we agreed on many things, and other things we had different points of view. So always a fun conversation. Well, great. Well, thank you all. It's great to be here with you, and I'm going to talk a bit about the book. I'm going to talk about sort of globalization and regionalization, and I want to talk about why it matters for the United States and why it matters for Mexico, and then really why it matters for what is to come, and particularly given supply chains and nearshoring and friendshoring and ally-shoring and the way we're thinking about the world, why where we have been really matters for where we might get to down the road. So let me talk a little bit first about globalization and regionalization. And here, if you read the news or you're in a boardroom or you're in a government meeting and the like, for the last 30 or 40 years, everybody has been talking about globalization, and some people love it and some people hate it, and there's lots of strong feelings about it. But I think we fundamentally misunderstand the most important economic phenomena of the last few decades. And what happened more, and often much more, than globalization was regionalization. And those nations that regionalized did much better economically and commercially than those that did not. So let me just lay out what I call sort of two myths about globalization these last kind of 30 or 40 years, where people talk about hyperglobalization. And these are sort of the last two big fallacies of the way we think about it. And the first fallacy is that we often assume that globalization was all-encompassing, all-penetrating, and affected everybody around the world. And that's just not the case. There have only been about 24 countries, 25 countries to be specific, that saw trade transform their economies over the last 30, 40 years. So where trade as a percentage of GDP doubled or more. In contrast, there are 89 countries that saw trade as part of their economy stay the same, and many countries even where trade as part of their economy decreased. So there's a good number of countries that de-globalized over these last 40 years. So it hasn't been a case of everybody affected by globalization in this sort of juggernaut way. In fact, it's very few countries that participated. So that's one myth, I would say. The second myth is that when companies went abroad, and they did, we've seen trade go from $2 trillion in 1980 to $22 trillion today. So there's been a huge increase in trade. But when they went abroad, they usually didn't go to the other side of the world. Some did, right? We have companies like Boeing that source from 57 different countries, and Coca-Cola and other countries. There's lots of companies that we know, big brand names that have become global. But alongside those very high profile cases that we know about, there are thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of companies that did go abroad, but they usually went next door or pretty close by. And one telling statistic here is that the average good that is traded only travels 5,000 miles. And that is about the distance from New York to Los Angeles. So it is not getting you to Shanghai, right? It is not getting you to Berlin. It is much closer than, it's not as global as you would think. And so when you combine these two factors, not that many countries participated in this globalization of the last 30, 40 years. And when they did, they didn't go usually to the other side of the world. More often than not, they stayed closer by. And what you've gotten in our global trade and our global economy is three big regions: a European one, an Asian one, and a North American one. And between those three big manufacturing and trading hubs, 90% of all trade happens. So you think about all the other parts of the world: South America, Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, including India. It's only 10% of global trade. They're a very small part of it. They're not part of globalization in a real significant sense. And so that is one thing that has happened here. And I think we sort of misunderstand, but it's really important for thinking about how things work. And then within that, you have these sort of three big regions, but not all these regions are created equal either. They've gotten there in different paths, and I can talk about those if people are interested in sort of the historical way that they got to be integrated and regionalized. But what has happened over the last 30, 40 years is that Europe and Asia, in different ways, have regionalized and integrated much more than North America. And I would argue that is to their commercial and economic benefit, and often to North America's detriment. And just to give you some numbers to sort of make sense of it. So Europe, about 2/3 of trade happens within Europe. So they make things together and they sell things to each other. Asia, if you looked in 1980, 30% of trade was intra-regional trade. So within Asia, that has grown to 60% today. So they make things together. In fact, they make half of the stuff in the world today. And then they increasingly sell things to each other. In North America, on the eve of NAFTA, about 40% of trade was between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. It rose to 48, 49%. So almost half, almost 50 cents out of every dollar was within the region in the 1990s up to 2001. And then it fell back in the 2000s to about 40% again. So North America is more regionalized than South America or Africa or the Middle East, who really, when they trade with places far away. But it's much less regionalized than Europe, and then now much less regionalized than Asia. And I think that has been one of the issues for U.S. economic competitiveness and lots of things that we really care about. So this kind of shows, how you get to a stronger economy, how you sort of become more economically competitive. Much of it is regionalizing and tying yourselves to your neighbors with supply chains. So this all matters because it matters. It explains some of the problems we've had or some of the challenges we've had with, labor markets and jobs and that sort of things over the last, 30, 40 years. But it's really important for what comes now and what comes next. Excuse me, because this is the baseline for all of the economic changes that are happening today. And there, to me, we're seeing another set of transformations as big as the globalization, the quote unquote globalization of the last 30 or 40 years. And so there's sort of two big trends today that are leading to a once in a generation shift in global supply chains. And these are geopolitics and industrial policy. And I'm going to talk about each of these in turn, but together, these are really reshaping global markets, and they're reshaping just the basics of commercial profits and losses in ways that we haven't seen for decades. And in this, there are going to be some companies are going to be winners and losers, some sectors, some nations are going to see gains, and others are going to see real costs and disadvantages. I would say that the United States and Mexico are very well positioned within this for lots of reasons that I'll talk about, but only if they choose to take advantage of it. and frankly, only if they choose to embrace this regionalization, because that still will be incredibly important in terms of being globally competitive in the kinds of products and services that companies and the larger economy provides. So let me just talk a little bit about this and sort of this once in a generation reshuffling of global supply chains. And I think it's useful to sort of give hard numbers on this, or at least, what we have in terms of survey data and the like. So if you look at the last 30 years, only between 1% and 2% of supply chains would cross borders each year. Now, these are the years of quote unquote hyper-globalization and all of that, but it was much more limited movement than one would think. And the reason is that, it sort of attests to why supply chains are so sticky. And so if you run a company and you have a supplier that can deliver at the right price on Tuesday morning with the right quality at the right time, you don't change it, right? You don't just change and go to another supplier or go to another country, because if you make the wrong bet, you lose profits or maybe even go bankrupt. So supply chains are very sticky. And so for 30 years, only 1% to 2% would move across borders each year. Now in the last 3 years or so, that has totally changed. And we see it in survey data. We see, surveys of hundreds and thousands of companies, U.S. chambers of commerce or European chambers of commerce or others. And when they interview CEOs, they're finding that anywhere between 20 and 30% of CEOs are saying they already are moving their supply chains or they're seriously thinking about it. So you go from 1% to 2% to a higher number. Some are just seriously thinking about it, but maybe a 10-fold, even 20-fold increase there. There's a huge change. You're also starting to see it in the trade data. You look at overall trade data, and yes, U.S.-China trade is near record highs, but the percentage of U.S.-Chinese trade has come down significantly. And so for both countries, if trade had kept up with the rest of the world, you would see a much higher number, right? It's 20% down than where it would be if trade had kept up with the rest of the world. And just to put a number on this, if China imports to the United States had kept up with the past, we would, or with the rest of the world trade, the U.S. would be importing $150 billion more a year worth of trade from China, which it is not. So that's $150 billion that has gone to other places. We're also seeing it in foreign direct investment numbers. So there you're seeing, China had been for a couple decades the magnet, foreign direct investment pouring into China. Today, it's a net outflow. You're seeing more money coming out of China, especially from multinationals and international companies than you had in the past. And that is the trade of tomorrow, right? Those are the labs and the factories and the distribution centers and logistics and things that would have been invested in that will not be guiding trade in the future. And so you're starting to see that foreign direct investment go to other nations around the world. And so that is sort of a precursor for the trade that will happen in the future, at least some of that money. So we're seeing all of this movement. And I think, the question is why and why now? And, I would argue that the main forces moving this is that we are moving from market forces guiding commercial decisions and footprints and, for manufacturing and the like, to geopolitics and industrial policy guiding supply chains. So in a word, governments. Governments are now guiding policies in lots of different sectors, and they're changing the calculations that, companies and CEOs and supply chain managers have. And as a result, they're driving these various shifts. So let me talk a little bit about these two factors, and then I'll talk about what that means for the United States and Mexico and how we think about North America. So, the first one is geopolitics. Now, as we know, the sharpest breaks that we've seen recently are the Russia-Ukraine war. And in the wake of that, especially in the short to medium term, we saw huge disruptions to, food supply chains, fertilizer supply chains, a set of critical minerals, things like neon gas that go into semiconductor production. We had sort of a set of things that shifted. We have seen a little bit in the conflict in Israel and Gaza, a little bit of change. If that conflict would expand more regionally and bring in other actors, Iran or Egypt or others, one could imagine big shifts in energy markets and the like. Excuse me. So those are some shifts, but those have been somewhat so far manageable and insulated within the global economy. I would say the bigger shift that's really driving these supply chain shifts is the U.S.-China distancing, decoupling, de-risking, whatever the terminology you want to use there. And here we're seeing from both nations really a concerted efforts to de-link big parts of their economy. So there's a whole host of tools, lots of this we all know about. We had, tariffs. So we had Trump tariffs, which are now Biden tariffs. We have a whole host of export controls and licenses on an increasing number of technologies and other kinds of inputs. We have investment reviews, so making it harder for Chinese investment to come in the United States, and vice versa. You're seeing a little bit more into China, and then we see laws like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which, if that was enforced to the full extent of what's written into the law, you could imagine is almost unmeetable reporting requirements for a good chunk of imports that come into the United States from China. So there's a whole host of tools there. And I would say, China has responded in kind, right? We have seen data laws that make it very hard to transfer data in and out of China, and even make it very hard for, say, importers from China into the United States provide customs with the information they would need to meet the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act requirements. So there's challenges there. We see China supporting state-owned enterprises, national champions to the detriment of other companies. So sort of putting their finger on the scale in terms of competitiveness. We obviously have seen China in the past steal trade secrets, intellectual property, and all sorts of things. So there's a whole host of challenges there for U.S. and frankly international businesses more broadly operating within China. And so, yes, we have seen, especially over the last few months, we've seen some detente. Right today, President Biden and Xi are meeting together and meeting on a whole host of issues. They've announced some, moving forward on issues of climate and some military to military talks, as well as, working on fentanyl issues and the like. We've seen, secretaries of commerce, Secretary of Treasury, others talking to their counterparts and the like. But even with these meetings, overall, there really is a consistent and concerted effort, I think, between the two countries to continue to distance big parts of their economy, that both are seeing it as vital to their future national security as well as their prosperity to have some space within. And so I think we will continue to see this. This is going to be kind of a fundamental aspect of geopolitics, and one that will continue to push a change in supply chains around the world. So that's one set. The other set I want to talk about is another big kind of shift that's happening in supply chains is industrial policy. And here, I think one of the biggest changes of the last decade is the move away from, what people would call the Washington Consensus. And this was sort of a philosophy or a set of guidelines that was markets should drive trade, an aspiration at least that markets would drive trade. Governments were never not there, but this idea that you were working to open up, you're working to bring down tariff barriers or other non-tariff barriers, you were working to open up economies was sort of the mantra. And now you're seeing that lose luster. It's lost luster in emerging markets because many of the countries that opened up didn't grow as quickly as countries that didn't open up, like China. And in developed economies, sort of advanced industrial economies, the Washington Consensus or this free trade consensus, it didn't answer the political questions of the day, right? It didn't answer issues of inequality. It didn't answer issues of technological disruption. It didn't answer sort of questions of weak social safety nets or sort of how you kind of adjust your society and your economy with all of the shifts that were happening. And so it sort of has fallen out of favor. And what we've seen is governments around the world much more amenable and eager and ambitious to intervene in their economies. And you're seeing that happen more and more. I will say that today's industrial policy is very different than, say, the 1960s and 70s, in which there was a lot of industrial policy as well. Part of it is economic competition, which has always been there and will continue to be. But there's a few other issues on the table, which is why I think it will be much stickier and last much longer than perhaps in the past. So one of them is environment and climate reasons, right? Lots of countries have made promises and pledges to at COP, which is about to happen, and others to meet, net zero targets by certain times. And they need to hurry the green transition, right? They need to bring in renewables into their energy grids and the like. And so there's a role for government to play in making that transition happen. So that's one of the reasons we're seeing industrial policy. Another is back to sort of has to do with the US-China, but it is national security. And increasingly, governments are defining bigger parts of the economy as vital to their national security in ways that we haven't seen for a long time, I would say, or at least the ambition of it for a long time. So given all these different reasons that countries are doing it, one, we're seeing a scale we haven't seen before. And just to give you a statistic, in the last 15 years between the European Union, the US, and China, we have seen just those three blocks of nations put in place over 20,000 subsidies. And every year we're seeing more. Those are just those few blocks of countries. Other countries are also doing it as well. So we're seeing a huge increase in the number of interventions. And, we're also just seeing sort of a scale and ambition that we haven't seen in the past. And so what does this mean? Let me take this now to, okay, so what is this geopolitics and industrial policy guiding so many commercial decisions in ways that it hasn't for a long time? What does it mean for supply chains? And let me just talk a bit about what it means for the United States and Mexico, and really thinking about North America within all of this. And so for the United States, well, the United States is driving a lot of these changes, right? They're one of the big parts of the geopolitics, and then they're driving the geopolitics. And they're one of the big participants in industrial policy, right? We have seen the United States allocate much of it on a bipartisan basis, over $2 trillion in the last few years, whether it's through infrastructure, whether it's through Chips and Science Act, so for semiconductors, and whether it's through the Inflation Reduction Act, which has a whole sort of green transition side of things, electric vehicle cars, but also solar, wind, grids, all kinds of stuff, and money there within. So the U.S. is a big part of this. We're seeing big upticks in investment, and both in all of these sort of areas, as well as in manufacturing and other things. So you're seeing a change in the economy. There is, effort and momentum in the economy. But what we're also beginning to see, even at these beginning parts, is that the United States isn't going to be able to do it alone. And so we're seeing labor shortages in some things, and especially in particular skills and the like. We're seeing some of the things they need, lack of critical minerals. There just aren't mines. There just aren't processing centers for some of the stuff that would go into, say, an electric vehicle battery here in the United States. We're seeing some higher prices in some of these areas, and worries about kind of long-term competitiveness when the subsidies go away. So there's beginning to see some of the challenges to how one would, especially if you're trying to reshore all this to the United States. Which brings us a bit to Mexico, and I can talk a bit about Canada, but we'll focus mostly on Mexico because that's sort of where it's the bigger country in terms of population, and it also provides a complement in some of these areas that Canada does not. Though Canada has lots of the critical minerals that we sort of need or potentially need for a lot of these new technologies. So there's a big part that Canada can play as well. So just focusing in on Mexico a bit. So Mexico really holds huge advantages in this kind of new world of geopolitics and industrial policy for the United States, and particularly for North America in this kind of race or sort of competition that's out there. And Mexico already had some market-based advantages, right? Mexico has always benefited from proximity to the United States. And particularly with, COVID and the disruptions to transportation and logistics and the like, nearness matters, right? You're not waiting for ships to get across the ocean where you have sort of, hiccups or bottlenecks that we saw, in disruptions during the sort of COVID times. So that's a benefit. You're also just on a market basis seeing many products, as we all know, we use Amazon way too much, or maybe we don't use it enough. You can all decide. But everybody expects things tomorrow, right? And so when there's sort of a time is money, which is increasingly so, 6 weeks across the ocean to get your new shirt or your new computer or whatever is too much time, right? You may lose orders. So there's benefits, Mexico and other countries, for proximity that's increasing in terms of consumer demand and the like. So that's one side. Another market benefit is, Mexico, frankly, in terms of labor, costs less than China does today. Chinese wages have grown pretty significantly. Mexico ones have grown slower. And particularly when you factor in productivity, there's lots of things one can make in Mexico, more products for, less money than in China and other places around the world. So there's sort of a market-based benefit there, I would say. Excuse me. And then another thing Mexico has is after 25, 30 years of integrating with the United States and Canada into particular supply chains, things like automotive and aerospace and processed food and some machinery and the like, Mexico has a pretty deep ecosystem of suppliers and inputs and the like, that if you're trying to relocate supply chains, there's some benefit there. Because I think one of the challenges for companies that are looking to move is, you can move, but you need all these suppliers because nobody makes everything anymore, right? And that's sort of the big shift of the last globalization, the last 30, 40 years is it's not one company making everything. It's companies specializing and making particular parts in a supply chain that then come together. And so you need those other pieces and other suppliers to actually do this in a profitable way. And so Mexico has some of that base, and a pretty significant base after 3 decades almost of building that up. So those are the market advantages, but geopolitics, industrial policy really play to the advantage of Mexico as well. So on the geopolitics, Mexico is a firm ally of the United States. Anybody who reads the Mexican papers or listens to the president, you'll know that there's always tensions, there's always complications, and like any good siblings, a little bit of a tensions at the family dinner, but in the end, there is just a wealth of commercial ties, of family ties, community ties, of working together in various international bodies and the like. And this is really, we see it as this is a firm ally for the United States, and one that's important, and that going forward. A lot of that is also baked into what was NAFTA, which is now USMCA, and so there's a pretty deep trade agreement there that has all the commercial sides and gets rid of tariffs and like, also has labor, has environmental provisions, has other things in there now. So pretty deep connections there and ways of working together, sort of a set of ground rules that we don't have with lots of other countries for all kinds of investments. So that too is important. That sort of preferred market access is important. And so those are sort of the geopolitical benefits, I would say, and I'm happy to talk more about those later. They're also big for Mexico industrial policy benefits. And Mexico does not have its own industrial policy, particularly the current president and sort of the focus of that government. But Mexico benefits directly and significantly from U.S. industrial policy. And I think no other country besides Canada benefits as much. And one of the biggest is through the Inflation Reduction Act. And, over these last 30 years, you've seen one of the most integrated regional sectors has been the automotive and transportation sector, right? So cars and trucks and all of the like. And I think there's an argument to be made that if we had not had that integration, there may not be any trucks or cars produced in North America, right? It would have been cheaper to do it elsewhere and we would not see them in the United States. But we have them, the US being the center of those markets. But I think there's a real question up until recently about whether Mexico would make the transition from combustible engines, so gas-fired engines, to electric vehicle engines, because it's different industry. Gas-fired car, the kinds that we drive today, or many of us still drive today, has hundreds of parts, if not thousands of parts. There's all different, lots of different parts, and Mexico makes lots of those along with the United States. But there's a question when you get to an electric vehicle, it's less steel, it's more plastic, it's fewer parts, it's dozens, not hundreds. And because of the weight of a battery, it makes more sense to be nearer to the consumer in terms of shipping and the like. So there's a real question about Mexico would be part of this new supply chain, or how much of a part. And the Inflation Reduction Act ensures that there will be a space for Mexico, I would say, because what we have there is the subsidies within the Inflation Reduction Act, which are up to $7,500 per car, which is a significant amount. I don't know if any of you have bought a car recently, but that gets you a pretty nice car. It's a big discount on a pretty nice car. And it ensures that manufacturing can be done in any of the North American partners, Canada, Mexico, or the United States, in order to apply for that. That is, I will say, a benefit for US makers as well, because it makes sure that the costs of those cars, you can spread them out across the three countries, and you can have customers across the three markets because of sort of the North American ties together. So in the wake of that, you've seen investments come into Mexico. You've seen Tesla, GM, Ford, Toyota, others announce they're going to do electric vehicle, parts of electric vehicle, manufacturing, assembly, and the like there. You start to see those created supply chains. So that's going to be a benefit as they go forward. I think there's space too for Mexico in terms of, the CHIPS Act. So we think about semiconductors, the whole point of putting tens of billions of dollars into semiconductor, supporting semiconductor industry in the United States was to make them secure. And we have seen in the United States big investments by Intel, by TSMC, by some of the big, those who make the microchips, the really capital intensive and very sophisticated and high skilled labor, fabs, they call them, in Arizona, in Ohio, in New York, and other places. But if you really want national security, you have to secure the whole supply chain, not just the one part. You have to have the inputs in places that you're going to get them. And you have to have the testing and packaging that comes at the end in places that that you'll get them back out. And right now, for instance, most of the testing and packaging, it happens in Asia, and a big portion happens in China. So it doesn't improve our national security to make the microchip in Arizona and then ship it to China to have the final testing and packaging happen, right? That needs to happen in other countries. If that's the reason for these bills, which is what at least that's what people said that the reason for these bills were. So So where do you do that part? That's more mid-skill. It's sort of technical, but not particularly complicated. It's not as expensive, doesn't need quite as much capital, but it does need a safe place and a pretty competent workforce. And I think there, Mexico, as long as other countries in the Western Hemisphere could be good alternatives to China or other nations that are across the Pacific as we think about building out that supply chain. So given all of these geopolitical industrial policy, benefits and the push by the United States government, where are we in kind of fixing these supply chains or making them safer? And let me talk a little bit about that before we kind of open it up. And here, we have seen a good amount of investment come into Mexico, but it has been more of a stream than a tsunami of money, I would say. And there's a couple of reasons why. One is that regionalization wasn't totally to Mexico's benefit. So Mexico is tied to the biggest consumer economy in the world, the United States, and that's a benefit. But it's not tied to the biggest producing countries in the world, because that has become Asia. Because 50% of all manufacturing today happens in Asia. And so if companies are looking to get out of China, we have to remember, they have suppliers probably all over Asia, right? They were assembling in China, or maybe some parts they were making in China, but not all of them. And so it's easier in many ways to move to Vietnam or Indonesia or Malaysia because you can keep all of your other suppliers because they're all pretty near each other, right? You're all within hundreds of miles of each other, not thousands of miles away. So one thing is, Mexico was neither is the United States, but Mexico is not located next to lots of those other suppliers. So you have to recreate this whole ecosystem, which is complicated if you don't already have a base. So that's one issue. But maybe the other issues why we haven't seen so much investment in Mexico are in its control. So one of them is security and rule of law. Every CEO or company I talk to that operates in Mexico or is thinking about operating in Mexico, the security of their facilities, of their people, of their trucks that go to the border with their goods is a concern because they have such a difficult time making sure the roads and cities and locations are safe from organized crime and from others. Mexico spends less than 1% of GDP on security. That compares to, Colombia or places spend over 2%. So they just don't spend enough in making their country secure. And in sort of security side, and, I would argue they spend more on military than on civilian police and other forces that are actually what you need to make sure city streets that, general criminality is brought down. So there's lots Mexico could do. And we have seen in Mexico examples where you have seen significant falls in crime, places like Ciudad Juarez and Monterrey and other cities where you really have seen, places that were very dangerous become much safer than they were in the past. So it's not a hopeless situation. They have their own examples that work, but they have yet to really roll that out across the country and put force behind it. And that's something that they need to do. The second big thing I would say, the challenge in holding a lot of companies back is access to electricity and energy more broadly, and particularly renewable energy. So this government in Mexico has slowed the investment by private sector and others into the energy sector, and they have a huge paucity with demand is far outpacing supply. They have not invested through the state enterprises, the state energy, electricity grid and the like in the demand that they need. And, the latest numbers I've seen is they need to invest somewhere between 40 and $50 billion just to keep up with demand over these next few years. And if they don't, you'll start seeing literally the lights go out in some parts of the country, maybe in the next couple of years. So that is a huge challenge for the government and for the next government, because we're going to see elections happen next June and a new president come in the following October. The other challenge there is many international corporations, because of their green commitments and the like, need to have a part of their energy be from renewable sources. And Mexico under this administration has gone back and had become less clean, more fossil fuel heavy than it has in the past. And so that too is somewhat of a challenge for these various corporations. There's other stuff there. There's, water issues in some parts of the country. There's, education and skilled labor for particular industries and how you sort of scale up in various areas. And those are real concerns as well. So labor shortages and particular things. But overall, what you're seeing is a good amount of investment, but not as much as you're seeing, for instance, vis-a-vis Vietnam or Poland or Indonesia. You look at sort of foreign direct investment numbers, and as things leave China, Mexico is not capturing, I would say, its share, or what it could be its share, given the advantages that it has. So let me just summarize just a little bit, and then we can just open up to questions and make it more interactive. And what does this all mean? So, I think what I would say is one, these phenomena that we're seeing, the geopolitics, industrial policy, are not transitory, they're fairly permanent. I mean, permanent is a long time, right? But as Keynes says, in the long run, we're all dead. So I would expect the rest of the 2020s, these are going to be the key driving forces in the global economy, or sort of new forces. And we're going to see this movement of supply chains. We're at the beginning, we're not at the end. And there I would say, if anything, whatever happens in the US elections next year, I think one thing, whomever's sitting in the Oval Office, come 2025, the hardening vis-a-vis the United States and China is not going to end, because that does seem, as we all know in Washington, there's not a lot that Republicans and Democrats agree on, but this does seem to be an issue they agree on. And every bill that's become law that focuses on US China and sort of the hardening, like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, was passed with strong bipartisan support. So I expect us to be at the beginning, not the end of this. And then in terms of industrial policy, these hundreds of billions, these trillions of dollars that are being laid out, they're just hitting the economy. They're just being spent and implemented. So the effects of that are going to happen over the rest of this decade. And we see other countries joining, right? European Union is doing what they can, some with money, but more through regulation. Japan has joined, Brazil has joined, India has policies. There's lots of more that are coming in. So there's more coming into the global economy in terms of industrial policy. And China continues as well to do theirs, which they always have. So there's more coming in than less. So I think we're going to see more of this, or the effects are coming. And really the effects on company decisions and commercial, costs and balances there'll be more rather than less as we go forward. The other reality is that, deglobalization is not what's happening, right? We hear a lot like, oh, are we deglobalizing? We're not. International supply chains and international production are still going to be the most profitable way to make things. But that said, where it happens, that is moving. And what I think it's also telling us is that regional production is still going to be vital for global competitiveness, right? So it'll be closer to your allies, it'll be closer to countries that you know and you trust, and you might have free trade agreements, but it's still going to be important to be international if you're going to be commercially viable and internationally competitive without significant subsidies for the long term. So what this means is the United States is not going to be able to do this on its own. And Mexico is not going to be able to do this on its own, nor will Canada. So there is a need here for regionalization, because Asia is going to remain regionalized, Europe is going to remain regionalized, and other parts of the world are trying to do it too. Africa is trying to do it, and other places in the world are trying to do it. The other thing is, so deglobalization is not happening. Regionalization is still important. But the other thing that's worth remembering is that supply chains, even though they're moving around, we see this once in a generation fluidity, they're still going to be sticky. And so while they're moving today, once they've resettled and sort of because of geopolitics, because of industrial policy incentives and subsidies and the like, once they're settled, they're going to stay put again until governments or markets or natural disasters or whatever force them out of their space. And so while the United States and Mexico have a big opportunity today, it's not an opportunity that's going to last forever. And so these next 3 to 5 years are very decisive ones. And to take advantage, these two countries, along with Canada, are going to need to work together. So with that, let me turn it over to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Shannon, for that wide-ranging and fascinating overview. We have a couple of questions in the chat already, which I'll read. But I just wanted to remind everyone that you can add your questions to the chat if you would like to ask it out loud. I think I can, if you let me know in the chat you'd like to ask a question, I think I can enable your microphone and let you do that. We can at least try. But to start, a question from Greg, or perhaps Greg is channeling others. He asks, so first of all, what do you see as, and you've mentioned a few of them perhaps, but the greatest risks to North American integration? And I may add to those that you mentioned from outside, or in the case of security in Mexico and these sorts of questions. We might also have risks from inside as well in terms of the politics of North American integration. And related to that, Greg says in the book you described the USMCA as NAFTA for populist, he asks, how do other regional agreements in different regions, the EU or in Asia, compare to USMCA?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions. Okay, so
Yeah.
so the excuse me. So the greatest risk to integration, I think for many years, the greatest risk to integration and why we've seen limited integration, there's been a couple things. So, the outside risk, like one of the biggest challenges to NAFTA and USMCA was and has been China. So one of the reasons why you saw an increase from, 40% regional trade to 48, 49%, and then back down was China coming into world markets and just the effect of China. And we think about in the United States the cost of China, and there's been papers written like the China shock, where maybe 1 to 2 million jobs left the United States, and sort of the cost to communities that were focused there. But I would say Mexico, at least per capita, if not in absolute terms, suffered more from China coming into the WTO than the United States did, because Mexico was such a direct competitor to the kinds of things China was doing, especially in the 2000s compared to the United States. So, Mexico used to have a toy industry that creating toys. They're gone, right? Shoe industry, gone. Lots of other industries, even just, they used to make faxes. No one makes faxes anymore. But when they did, right? Printers, I mean, all those kinds of, kind of basic electronics. Mexico used to have a vibrant industry, and then that all went to Asia. So really lost a lot of that. So that was a cost to Mexico and their jobs. It was also a cost to the United States. You look back at 1990s, 2000, and 90% of what Mexico imported from other parts of the world came from the United States. Today, it's less than 50%, right? And a lot of that is Chinese imports. They get their iPhones from there. They get whatever else that they're importing are coming from Asia, from those Asian supply chains. So one of the biggest challenges to North America, I would say, is can North American nations make products, as good, fast, and cheap as very efficient and robust Asian supply chains? And there, if anything, over those last 5 years, Asia has been putting in place various things, which gets to one of your other questions, putting in place various things, including free trade agreements, to make them more competitive at international markets rather than less, right? So you see the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which sort of wraps up 15 Asian countries, including China, and makes rule of origin between all of those nations the same, or sort of unified. And what that basically does is nobody pays tariffs going across. So you can bring parts in from all 15 of those countries, nobody pays tariffs, and then you can ship them out to the world. So it makes it slightly cheaper. In comparison, just, the United States has agreements with 11, 12 countries in the Western Hemisphere, but some of them are by bilateral agreements, some of them are multilateral agreements, and none of the rules of origin wrap up. So if you're in Mexico and you bring in something from Central America, you would have to pay a tariff because it doesn't match up. Even though all these countries have agreements with each other, they're not unified. And so it'll just mean products made here are more expensive, on the margin than they are in Asia. And so I think that's one challenge sort of for North American competitiveness, is how do you make it so that those kinds of, logistics costs and tariff costs and non-tariff costs are lower, so that you can make a product that's good and cheap, not just to sell here, but to sell to the rest of the world, right? Because in all those other markets around the world, you're competing with Asian supply chains, European supply chains, or supply chains from other parts of the world. So that's the outside ones. The inside ones, I would say, are politics, right? I'm sure everybody here on this call has heard a little bit of the politics of NAFTA and USMCA, and I talk about it in the book. I look at a lot of studies about what NAFTA did or really didn't do, and the careful studies, people who really look into this, basically what it did was nothing, right? It was kind of a wash, right? There's studies out there that say, oh, NAFTA, 200,000 jobs a year disappeared because of NAFTA. But when you look at what those studies do, they only count imports from Mexico into the United States. They don't count U.S. exports that go back to Mexico. It's as if they only took one side of the ledger. And if you count the other side, basically that created 200,000 jobs. So basically, now they're different jobs, right? They're trade jobs versus others. But we do know is in the United States, on average, jobs that are involved with trade pay 18% more than jobs that are not involved with trade. So if it created 200,000 new jobs, those jobs pay better than others. Now, they're not in the same places, and that's often the challenge, right? And they're not the same jobs. They're in different industries because we export to Mexico or to other parts of the world different kinds of stuff than we import. So they're definitely disruptions, right? There's no question there. But overall, and I think the counterfactual is, what if we didn't have NAFTA? What if we didn't have an agreement with Mexico and Canada, and we didn't have preferred access? Would we have a car industry anymore? Would we be able to make a car that could compete with imports from other countries, even if the imports, we charge 25% on those imports? Could we really make a car that was 25% cheaper than those made in other parts of the world if we didn't have Canada and Mexico participating? And I think the argument, at least for many models that all of us drive, is no, we couldn't make them for 25% cheaper, which is what the current tariff is on trucks or on SUVs and the like, right? On cars, it's only 2%. So can we make them 2% cheaper? No, we definitely couldn't. We wouldn't have any car models. Those would all be imported, right? So this is the challenge. So all those jobs in Detroit and Alabama and Tennessee and all those places might not be there at all if we didn't have NAFTA, now USMCA. Okay, so that's now the politics are hard, right? Because every time you hear like, oh, there's a factory to open in Mexico, that took US jobs. Now it also kept US jobs. And then if you can make a car for $30,000 and not $40,000, more people will buy those cars. And so you'll have more cars out there. So yes, part of the work, 25% of the work is in Mexico, 75% of the work is in the United States, but if it's, if you sell twice as much, then there's more jobs around, right? And if you can sell it to other markets all over the world, which I think is the aspiration of an EV market, right, of electric vehicles, not just sell them to ourselves, but let's sell them to everybody. That's what the Chinese are going to do. You have, 7 billion people who could potentially be consumers. But how do you do that in a commercially viable way? And I think that is the challenge. And I would argue the way you get there is these agreements. But the politics are really rough. And in all of the countries, the politics are really rough for integration. Great, I don't know if I answered all the questions, but we can re-ask any of them.
That's great. If you don't mind, because I know you have a hard stop, maybe I'll give you two questions together, and maybe we can close there. The first is about the sort of the division between firm decisions as a driving factor here and the role of governments. So I'm wondering, what the question is sort of what role for governments in advancing regional integration? What sorts of metrics would you use to assess that? And maybe for this audience, if you have any thoughts on sort of the role of policy at the borders in enhancing the effectiveness of regional supply chains. And then the final question from Elizabeth Vincent, she asks, what are some of the challenges to nearshoring with South America, which you mentioned a bit in terms of having disparate agreements, is kind of this web of FTAs, but particularly she asks around economic instability, Chinese influence, and perhaps lingering resentment about historic U.S. involvement in the region. I'll turn it over to you for those final simple questions.
Yeah. The interesting thing I would say on the integration is different places have gotten there in different ways. And Europe got there in a very top-down way with, treaty after treaty. There's the Treaty of Rome, the Treaty of Lisbon, the Treaty of Maastricht, the treaty of every city has a treaty, right? And it was very much, tariffs and non-tariff barriers. And then it was, court systems and legislatures and all kinds of regulations and bodies that became European. So it was very top down. Now, the United States, Canada, Mexico are never going to do that, right? That's not the model that we're going to do. The Asian model was very interesting because it wasn't that. They have free trade agreements now, but much of the integration happened without any free trade agreements at all, without any international bodies at all. And it was much more driven by businesses. It was first Japanese businessmen going to, at the time, very poor Taiwan and South Korea and setting up outsourcing factories because they needed labor after, World War II shortages and the like. And then Taiwan and South Korea kind of went up the value-added scale, and then they started sending money and building factories in Thailand and Vietnam and China and other places. And so you sort of seen this led by the private sector. Governments helped. Governments would go, the Japanese government would go build a port so that their factories could build in South Korea and then send out. So there was some, infrastructure and support, but it was really led by the private sector. And I would say in North America, it's sort of a middle between the two, and a Goldilocks middle, but not in a good way, the way we usually think about Goldilocks, right? It's like the treaties we have NAFTA, but it really is just a commercial agreement and even just an investment agreement, right? And so it allowed some things. It allowed, arbitration, and it allowed sort of security of investments, and it allowed, took down tariffs and some other things, but it wasn't sort of that integrating force that you saw in Europe. On the one side. And then the other side, you've seen some sectors and some businesses really focus on integration. Autos is a big one, aerospace, there's a couple other sectors, but not as widespread as you would have seen. And sort of to the point about the border, one thing we have not done is significantly invested in the infrastructure that lowers the logistics costs, and especially across the three countries. And, I talk about this actually in both of my books. I have some examples that are just like, really, that happened, where one, we don't invest a lot. So you've got trade that has gone up, fourfold, and the number of border crossings and sort of infrastructure has not kept pace at all, right? Like the last time, it's been 100 years since we built a railroad crossing up until very recently, even though it's a totally different economy. So that's one challenge, I'd say. And the other challenge is when we do put money down there, we often don't coordinate with the other side. And so, we invested $500 million in a crossing on the US side that was going to be for fruits and vegetables and sort of speed it, but we didn't really work with the Mexican government. So there's still only a 2-lane road that comes into this very fancy modern port. And in the end, it just didn't work because of, you didn't have kind of coordinating of infrastructure that would have allowed these logistics and speeding and making it efficient for both sides, or for all the kind of companies and the like who are making these decisions. And, a difference for North America, for good or bad, but probably I think for good, is that, we don't have state-owned enterprises, right? We have private firms. And so those firms are making decisions. Their board of directors or their CEOs or, their management teams are making decisions. It's not going to be made by governments. There can be incentives, right? You give subsidies or you encourage one way or another. But really where the US government or Mexican or Canadian governments can influence is in creating infrastructure, whether it's physical or digital, education, the kinds of sort of social safety net stuff that then allow companies and encourage companies to come and be part of it. And I think in the end, that leads to a more innovative entrepreneurial outcome than a state-owned enterprise, which is like, you must invest here because that's what our political sort of ramifications are. But you know what? Jury's out on some of these decisions, right? We'll see in that sort of space. In terms of the rest of the Western Hemisphere, I do think, as I look at the way the United States is thinking about more and more parts of the economy in a national security lens, whether that's semiconductors, electric vehicle batteries, critical minerals, pharmaceuticals, right? These are the areas that we feel like we need to make sure we have secure supply chains. And I look around the world, I see no place more than the Western Hemisphere that can provide a commercially viable solution to those challenges, right? This is a hemisphere of the world that has almost all of the kind of critical minerals that we need or that we have on our list, right? The DoD has a list that's 50 plus long, and most of them are available in the Western Hemisphere. It is, the United States does not have a lot of free trade agreements around the world. It has free trade agreements, so preferred access to less than 10% of the globe's GDP. But those it does, the majority are in the Western Hemisphere. So if you're trying to create supply chains that can compete with, RCEP or the ones in Asia or in other parts of the world, these are the ones we already have agreements with. And as we know, it's tough to get those through Congress right now. Nobody's really interested in that. So let's work with the ones we have. So I think that is a benefit that we have. And, these, as we look for kind of secure supply chains, countries we trust, yes, as Elizabeth says, there's been tensions in the past. There's, there's definitely frustration with the United States and some of the past legacy and sort of, some see it as imperialist or whatever you want to say. But I will say, talking with folks and leaders in a lot of these countries, China coming to the countries, they don't see as an unalloyed good, right? The Chinese, tend to be a bit brash and a bit pushy in various these things. Lots of their mines and sort of resource, kind of things that they buy don't always follow labor rules, don't always follow environmental rules. There's a lot of challenges there. They don't have things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Not that US companies always behave perfectly, but there are some sort of limitations when what they do around the world that sort of hold them back in ways that Chinese and other companies don't have. And as I have talked with leaders too, China has been great for the Western Hemisphere in the sense of, They have bought a ton of commodities. That's brought lots of money into the coffers to, pay taxes and allow social programs and the like. But they have also undermined manufacturing and other parts of the economy that would have allowed better jobs and allowed sort of sophistication and value added and allowed these economies to diversify and grow. And, just to give you a figure, so 70% of all the exports from Latin America to China are in 5 commodities. It's copper, it's iron ore, it's, lithium, it's 5, and we have seen deindustrialization in Brazil and Argentina and all these places. And so policymakers are struggling with this. So that's a short to bring it all together. Look, I think there's a huge opportunity for the United States in this sense. One, because it solves some of our problems, right? We have this, let's secure global supply chains in these 4 critical areas. How do we do it? Well, here's a solution. But 2, it can help them. It can help them diversify their economies, create better jobs, more sustainable, more inclusive ways of growth than selling your commodities to China or to anyone for that matter. So I think there is a space here to navigate if we can do that adeptly. So that is my aspiration and hopefully the goal of all of those in Washington.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Shannon, for this excellent presentation and discussion. It's been a pleasure to have you here to start this series. What a kickoff! And thank you to everyone who attended. And we hope to see you or have you here for future events as well. Greg, did you have any closing word you'd like to say?
Just another heartfelt thank you. This was wonderful, Shannon. Thanks so much. I appreciate just the insights and look forward to hearing more and reading more of what you're doing. So thank you so much. And for those of you that are on, just a reminder that December 12th, we'll be back and have Laura Alfaro and Katrina Stark-Fernandez coming in to speak on some of the same issues, similarly, looking a little more detailed at some of the data and how some of these shifts are taking place. So thank you, and everyone enjoy your day, and hopefully we've kept you on schedule. So thanks, Shannon.
Thank you all. Pleasure to be with you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thanks, Tom.